It's 1 p.m., 400 miles northeast of the Galapagos Islands. A radar operator stares at his screen, watching something that barely exists. 3 sweeps visible, 9 sweeps gone. Like someone flicking a light switch in a dark room. What he's tracking isn't supposed to be there. And in exactly 4 hours, it'll vanish into shipping lanes where 1,000 contacts move every day. But what this operator doesn't know yet is that this invisible target has backup coming. And those backup boats are about to turn a simple drug bust into something nobody trained for. The contact moved at 8 knots. That speed told the entire story before anyone said a word. Nobody legitimate travels that slow this far from land. 8 knots meant weight. 3 tons of cocaine riding so low that every wave washed across the deck. The bearing matched known smuggling routes running north from Colombia toward Mexico, where product changed hands and prices tripled overnight. The HC-130J Hercules circled at 5,000 feet. Engines droning in that steady rhythm that makes hours feel like days. The tactical coordinator switched from radar to thermal imaging. The ghost became solid. Heat signatures don't lie. 2 outboard motors. 3 bodies inside a tube barely bigger than a shipping container. Surface temperature matching ocean water within 2 degrees. These semi-submersible vessels sat 18 inches above the waterline on a good day. Painted gray-blue to match the Pacific. Fiberglass hulls giving back almost no radar signature. Invisible to the naked eye beyond 500 meters. But thermal imaging saw through all of it. The technology staring down from 5 miles up didn't care about camouflage or clever engineering. The crew had spotted it. That was step 1. Actually stopping it was where things got complicated. The math was brutal and simple. The closest Coast Guard cutter, the Seneca, could push 20 knots if her turbines cooperated. She sat 50 miles south, 2.5 hours to intercept at maximum speed. The smugglers would hit congested shipping lanes in 4 hours at their current pace. The kind of traffic where one gray-blue speck could disappear among 100 legitimate vessels. Radars lighting up with container ships, tankers, fishing boats. Finding that needle again would be impossible. Mission failure looked like an equation. Distance divided by speed equals time you don't have. The HC-130J relayed coordinates down to the Seneca. On the cutter's flight deck, controlled chaos replaced the usual routine. The MH-65 Dolphin helicopter crew got their scramble order within minutes. Pre-flight checks that normally took 30 minutes got compressed into 10. Weapons loaded while rotor blades were still tied down. Fuel calculations scribbled on knee boats already wet with ocean spray. The intercept point sat 150 miles out. An hour of flight time just to reach the target. The MH-65 carried enough fuel for 3.5 hours total. But combat maneuvering burned fuel faster than cruise flight. They'd need to reach the sub, stop it, hold position for 3 hours until Seneca arrived, then provide overwatch during boarding. After that, enough fuel to make it back and land on a moving ship. The fuel computer kept showing the same answer. They'd land with fumes in the tanks and hope in their hearts. The gunner checked the M2-40 machine gun mount while pilots ran through engine startup. The day before, the Traverse motor had stuck solid. Salt corrosion in the bearings. They'd freed it with penetrating oil and determination. Salt ate everything on a ship eventually. Electrical systems, hydraulics, bearing surfaces. It just preferred eating critical equipment during operations when you needed it most. Maintenance had signed off on the repairs. The mount had worked fine during test runs. But test runs happened in calm air without pressure. Real operations happened in salt spray with everything on the line. The helicopter lifted off and banked north. Every minute at high power meant 2 minutes less endurance later. The pilot watched his fuel gauge the way gamblers watch their last chips. Meanwhile, Seneca pushed through Pacific swells at flank speed. Her captain knew the timeline. They had to arrive before the smugglers could scuttle their cargo. One valve opened and 3 tons of cocaine would sink to depths no diver could reach. Evidence gone. Case closed before it started. The MH-65 arrived overhead at 2:15 p.m. local time, dropping through clear skies toward the semi-submersible. The pilot brought them down to 200 feet. Rotor wash hit the ocean surface like an invisible hammer. Water beneath them transformed into a mess of spray and foam. Waves radiated outward in perfect circles. The low-profile vessel started rocking in swells it was never designed to handle. The gunner grabbed the M240 controls to begin the warning shot sequence. Standard procedure. Fire ahead of the vessel. Give them a chance to stop voluntarily before things escalated. The mount didn't move. He tried again. Nothing. The Traverse motor was locked solid. frozen at 45 degrees off the helicopter's nose. Salt had crystallized in the bearings overnight. What penetrating oil had freed yesterday, humidity had seized again today. 40 pounds of resistance in a system designed for two. They had a machine gun that couldn't aim, and 2 hours minimum to hold position with it. The pilot made his adjustment without discussing options. He brought the helicopter into a sliding hover, flying sideways at 50 knots to line up the frozen gun with the target below. It wasn't something any manual recommended. But Coast Guard pilots don't always fly by manuals. They fly by what works in the moment. Fuel flow jumped immediately, 95 gallons per hour instead of 76. Sideways flight burned fuel like combat maneuvering because that's exactly what it was. But they needed those warning shots more than they needed perfect fuel economy. First burst hit the water 100 meters ahead of the semi-submersible. Tracer rounds visible even in daylight. The smugglers didn't react. They maintained 8 knots like nothing had happened. Maybe they thought the sideways approach meant equipment failure. Maybe they figured a broken helicopter wouldn't push the issue. They were half right. The equipment had failed, but the crew hadn't. The pilot brought them around for another pass, holding that awkward angle while the gunner tried to muscle the mount free with raw strength. Salt is patient. Steel is stubborn. But Coast Guard gunners are both of those things and meaner besides. Second burst. 50 meters from the bow. Still no response from below. The diesel engines kept their steady rhythm. Wake still trailing behind at 8 knots, third pass. 10 meters. The rounds impacted close enough that the crew below could feel the vibrations through the hull. Close enough to remove any doubt about what came next if they didn't comply. That did it. All 3 outboard motors shut down at once. Sudden silence strange after the constant drone. The semi-submersible went from barely moving to completely still, drifting in the swells while 3 men below deck contemplated every decision that led to this moment. The helicopter settled into an orbit pattern at 200 feet, frozen gun still pointing sideways like a broken weather vane. They'd stopped the vessel. That was step 1. Step 2 was keeping it stopped for the next 3 hours, and step 2 was about to get complicated. 12 minutes into holding pattern, the radar operator's voice came through the headset. 2 new contacts approaching from the southwest, moving at 40 knots. At that speed, they'd arrive in 12 minutes. The pilot kept his orbit over the semi-submersible but started dividing his attention between what he was guarding and what was coming. His fuel gauge showed numbers that made the math uncomfortable. Protection boats were standard Cartel procedure. They ran 10 to 15 minutes behind their submarines. Close enough to help if things went wrong, far enough to deny any connection if questioned. These weren't rescue vessels. They were insurance policies with outboard motors and attitude. The boats closed to 4 miles and started their own circle, maintaining 2,000 meters distance, just outside effective small arms range, but close enough to matter, close enough to make decisions complicated. The pilot could see them clearly now. Go-fast boats. Multiple people on deck. They weren't running. They were testing, probing, trying to figure out what the helicopter would do if pushed. Trying to find the edges of American resolve, one boat darted toward the semi-submersible, closing the distance to 1,500 meters before the pilot swung the nose toward it. Even with a broken gun mount, a helicopter pointing at you meant something. The universal language of military aviation. The boat veered off, but its partner immediately moved in from the opposite side. Pack tactics. Wolves testing a larger predator, trying to split the helicopter's attention, force it to choose which threat mattered more. The gunner was still fighting with the M240 mount, trying to break it free through pure determination and anger. Every time a boat approached, he'd wrestle the gun toward it, managing maybe 10 degrees of movement before salt and physics won again. The protection boats probably had their own weapons. AK-47s were standard Cartel equipment. At this range, accuracy was questionable, but lucky shots counted just as much as aimed ones when it came to puncturing fuel tanks or hitting hydraulic lines. The tactical situation was clear. 1 helicopter with a broken gun, 2 fast boats with unknown weapons, 1 semi-submersible worth approximately $75 million on the street, and Seneca still 90 minutes away. For 15 minutes, this dance continued, boats approaching and retreating, helicopter pivoting to track them, semi-submersible crew watching their backup probe American responses, looking for weakness, looking for hesitation. The pilot burned fuel at combat power settings, watching his gauge drop while running calculations in his head. He had enough fuel to witness this standoff for maybe 40 more minutes. Then he'd have to choose between staying on station or making it back to Seneca. Ditching in the Pacific was an option. Not a good one. Just an option. The protection boats knew the math too. They were trying to wait out the helicopter's fuel state. Force it to leave for the ship or risk swimming home. Classic cartel strategy. They couldn't win through force, but they could win through patience and arithmetic. One boat made an aggressive pass, closing to 1,000 meters before turning away. Testing response time. Testing aggression levels. The pilot pivoted the helicopter to face it, maintaining his orbit over the semi-submersible. The frozen gun meant nothing at this point. The helicopter's presence meant everything. The second boat moved while the pilot was focused on the first, closing from the opposite direction to 800 meters, both boats now equidistant from the target. Both moving in slowly, synchronized pressure from opposite sides. The pilot had to choose which boat to face, which threat to prioritize, which direction to point his broken weapon. He chose neither. Instead, he climbed to 500 feet, gaining altitude to show he could engage both if needed. The message was clear without words. Broken gun or not, outnumbered or not, low on fuel or not. This helicopter wasn't leaving until Seneca arrived. The protection boats got it. Whatever calculation they were running came up negative. They turned southwest and opened throttles, racing toward international waters at 45 knots, running home without their cargo, without their crew, without anything except the knowledge that they'd tried and failed. They hadn't rescued anyone, hadn't recovered millions in product, but they had managed to make the helicopter burn through fuel it didn't have to spare. Small victory in a larger defeat. Below them, the semi-submersible crew had stopped moving. 3 men sitting in a tube barely bigger than a coffin, waiting for what came next. But stopping a vessel and actually boarding it were two very different problems. Especially when the seas were building and time was running out, Seneca finally arrived on scene, creating a steel wall between the semi-submersible and any hope of escape. She slowed to 5 knots while the deck crew prepared the rigid-hulled inflatable boat for launch. The seas were running 6-foot swells with 8-footers building behind them. Not terrible yet, but the barometer was dropping fast. In an hour, maybe 2, launching would be impossible. The David crane swung the 7-meter RHIB over the water. 8,600 pounds of boat and operators hanging from a steel cable rated for twice that weight, but static ratings meant nothing in moving seas. Every wave that passed underneath multiplied the load. Compression on the way up, tension on the way down. The cable wasn't designed for the constant shock loading that ocean swells created. The crane operator watched the wave pattern, counting seconds between crests. 8 seconds meant dropping between waves. 6 seconds meant dropping on top of one. He waited for his moment, watching the ocean like a gambler watching cards. The moment came between sets. The ocean flattened for maybe 4 seconds. The operator hit the release. The RHIB dropped 6 feet and hit the water hard. Engines already running. The coxswain punched the throttles before the next wave arrived, shooting away from Seneca's hull at 20 knots. Getting crushed between 4,500 tons of steel and the Pacific Ocean was nobody's idea of a successful launch. The helicopter maintained its orbit at 200 feet. Fuel now down to 134 gallons. The pilot had done the math again. Witness the boarding. Provide overwatch. Then land back on Seneca before his aircraft transformed from a helicopter into a very expensive submarine. The frozen gun didn't matter anymore. The RHIB approaching at 45 knots with 6 armed operators. On board was all the firepower this situation needed. The coxswain brought the RHIB alongside the semi-submersible using the maritime technique called controlled collision. At 45 knots, he aimed straight for midship. Then, at the last second, he reversed engines and pivoted the stern, spinning the boat 90 degrees while killing forward speed. The RHIB slammed sideways into the semi-submersible, inflatable collar absorbing the impact, now grinding against the hull as both vessels rose and fell on different wave cycles. First operator jumped when the boats matched height, a 2-second window that wouldn't repeat for another 8. He landed hard on wet fiberglass, 40 pounds of gear and body armor making balance difficult, but his weapon was already up, sweeping for threats while his legs found their footing. The second operator followed, then the third, moving fast because the window wouldn't stay open. The semi-submersible rocked violently from the added weight, water washing across the deck with every swell. The other operators provided cover from the RHIB, weapons trained on the hatch, just in case these smugglers decided to get creative. Just in case someone below deck had different ideas about how this ended, one by one the operators dragged the crew out. 3 men, wet, exhausted, done fighting, hands secured behind their backs with zip ties, faces showing that unique expression of relief mixed with regret. Relief that they were still breathing, regret about everything that came next. An operator searched the vessel interior, making sure no one else was hiding down there, making sure there were no surprises. The space inside was barely 6 feet tall, hot, humid, reeking of diesel fuel and human sweat. Living conditions worse than most prison cells, and these men had been in there for probably 3 days straight. The search confirmed what everyone already knew: cocaine, wrapped in waterproof packages, stacked floor to ceiling, street value somewhere north of $75 million, enough product to fund cartel operations for months, enough evidence to send these 3 men away for decades. The RHIB crew secured the semi-submersible for tow, attaching a line that would let Seneca drag it back to port. Evidence, testimony, another vessel that wouldn't make another run. The helicopter circled one last time, then turned toward Seneca, fuel gauge showing numbers that made the landing interesting. The pilot set down on the moving deck with 98 gallons remaining. Enough fuel for maybe 20 more minutes of flight. Enough fuel to matter. The deck crew secured the aircraft, chaining it down before the next swell arrived. The gunner was already out, already attacking that frozen gun mount with tools and obscenities, determined to make sure it wouldn't fail again. On the main deck, the 3 smugglers sat with their backs against the bulkhead, watching the semi-submersible they'd lived in for 3 days bob behind the ship on a tow line. $75 million they'd never see, families back home they wouldn't visit for years, all because a radar operator saw something that barely existed. And because a helicopter crew refused to quit when their equipment did, the protection boats were probably back in Colombia by now, reporting what happened, telling their bosses that the Americans got aggressive, that the interdiction succeeded despite mechanical failures, that sending rescue boats didn't work this time. The criminal organizations were already working on their next submarine, already recruiting new crews, already planning new routes, but they learned something that day. The rules had changed. With new leadership came new enforcement. The Americans weren't just watching anymore, they were hunting. And they were willing to push broken equipment past its limits to get results. The Pacific absorbed this story like it absorbed everything. Waves washing away evidence, wind erasing memory. Just another day in a war fought beyond headlines, where radar operators track ghosts, where helicopter crews fly sideways because their guns won't turn, where fuel gauges show numbers that make math uncomfortable. The semi-submersible rode behind Seneca on its final voyage. Not to Mexico, not to street corners where products changed hands, but to an evidence warehouse where it would sit under fluorescent lights. Tagged, photographed, numbered, another trophy in a war that never really ends. 3 tons of cocaine. 3 arrested crew members. 1 disabled vessel, and 1 Coast Guard crew that proves something important. Equipment fails. Plans fall apart. Fuel runs low. But the mission doesn't stop because the machine gun won't turn. It just means you fly sideways until the problem gets solved. That's the difference between trying and succeeding, between watching and acting, between accepting failure and making broken things work anyway. The smugglers sat in Seneca's holding area, contemplating their choices. The Coast Guard crew secured their equipment, planning for the next mission. And somewhere south of the Galapagos, another semi-submersible was probably loading cargo right now. Another crew was climbing into a tube barely bigger than a coffin. Another race was about to begin, but the operators who stopped this one weren't thinking about the next fight. They were thinking about maintenance reports, about frozen gun mounts, about fuel calculations that came too close, about all the small details that separate success from swimming home. The war on drugs doesn't have dramatic endings. It has moments. This was one of them, a moment where everything that could go wrong went wrong. And the mission succeeded anyway, not because of perfect equipment or ideal conditions, but because the people holding the controls refused to accept that broken meant defeated. The sun set over the Pacific. Seneca steamed south with her prize in tow, and in aviation maintenance spaces across the fleet, technicians were already reading reports about frozen gun mounts, making notes, adjusting procedures, learning lessons written in salt spray and empty fuel tanks, because the next intercept was already brewing somewhere in the Pacific. The next semi-submersible was already cutting through swells at 8 knots. and the next helicopter crew would need every advantage they could get, including gun mounts that actually turned when needed. Hit subscribe for more real military operations.